Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. On July the 11th, China and the United Nations held an international symposium in Beijing to address the issues concerning cybersecurity and governance. With the increasing popularity of the Internet reaching into almost every sector of society, cybersecurity has become a complex transnational issue that requires global cooperation to ensure a safe Internet. What challenges and opportunities face the international community in cyber governance? And in the process of rulemaking for cyberspace, what role should the United Nations play? To discuss these issues and more, today I'm very happy to be joined by His Excellency Mr. Kim Woon-soo, Under Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs in the United Nations, and Ambassador Wang Qun, Director General of the Arms Control Department of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who is also China's chief negotiator on Iranian nuclear issues. But before we start the interview, let's look at this.
Building cyberspace norms, rules and principles, as well as promoting an open, secure, stable, accessible and peaceful ICT environment. That's what this international workshop on cybersecurity is all about. China proposes that all parties should engage in constructive dialogue and cooperation to ensure the cyberspace is shared and governed by all.
Cyberspace knows no traditional geographical and physical boundaries. Cybersecurity is built and shared by all. The pursuit of unilateral advantage through technological monopoly, the attempt to seek the so-called absolute security for oneself at expense of others' security, and the practice of making judgment on the basis of one's own interest or applying double standards are not just unpopular, but also detrimental to one's own security at the end of the day.
Cyberspace has brought various new challenges. The digital divide among countries and regions is widening. Infringement of personal privacy and intellectual property rights, or even cybercrimes and cyber-terrorism still exist. To tackle those problems, China advocates building a community of shared future in cyberspace.
China has promoted the initiatives of the Digital Silk Road and the China-ASEAN Information Harbor. Those will enhance cooperation on digital economy and deepen cybersecurity cooperation within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS to make more contributions to cyberspace governance.
The UN Under-Secretary General said a new UN group of experts on ICT development and cyberspace security will soon start its work. He also spoke highly of China's efforts on the formulation of rules on cybersecurity.
Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you.
In your estimation, what are the major issues of great concern for both sides, I mean the United Nations and China, regarding the vulnerability of global cyberspace governance? So we start from you.
That is an issue of increasing concern for the whole international community, because every aspect of human life is connected through the cyberspace, but the normative framework we have in cyberspace is still very much decentralized. So we have to develop an acceptable norm for responsible state behavior in cyberspace. So that's the challenge we have been looking together with the Chinese government.
It seems a lot of efforts have been made and remarkable progress have been achieved in the bilateral negotiations between the two biggest economies, China and the United States, on cybersecurity in particular, following, for example, a tough debate on industrial espionage in the internet world. Can you brief us on the progress, if any, between China and the United States?
Indeed. On the subject of cyberspace, it was widely perceived as if that both Washington and Beijing have a huge difference. From what has been transpired in our bilateral exchanges, we found that both Washington and Beijing not only have shared interests and responsibilities, but also they have confronted with common or similar challenges. And let me explain to you that, for instance, in the case of hackers, the attackers, or the commercial espionage you just referred to, I think we are the victims of the attack of hackers, but China for their part, are not just go into exaggerating the case or going into the public, but rather we would like to see how it could be worked out quietly. In fact, that China and the United States are the two biggest economies and beneficiaries as a result of the rapid development of internet. We, in fact, do see the common interest. And we also, I think, through the course of our negotiations and discussions, managed to reach consensus on lots of areas. For instance, how could the two sides could work together to fight cyber crimes, and how two sides could work together to deal with the cyber-enabled theft, and also I think in the field of cyber crimes, how could the two sides could work together. These are just a few of the areas the two sides could work together. But in one word, that once the two countries work together, we could serve the purpose of not only the purpose of bilateral relations for robust and healthy relations, but also could contribute to the sustainable development of a global cyberspace governance as a whole.
And if I had one more area of common interest between US and China is the growing nexus between terrorism, cyber attack, and nuclear, biological, material security. So unless we do better, international community as a whole, to combat this growing nexus, will be doomed. So there, two countries' leaders agreed on the need to take joint action of the international community, and also that was one of the important topics which was discussed at the recently concluded Nuclear Security Summit process in Washington.
That's the need. That exactly points to the need for an international legal instruments to combat cyber terrorism. But with the caveat that this is just one of them. And in your opening conversations, you tend to ask what is the problems, and you refer to the need for a rule-based cyberspace. In fact, that's exactly United Nations and China are work on. And in fact, that one of the lacunae of global cyberspace governance noticeably is the absence of legally based, legally binding instruments. So that's an area we should continue to work on, step by step, within the framework of the United Nations and also with the participation of all parties concerned. As for cyberspace, it is now virtually in the era of Western cowboys, if I may say so. And so that's why we need to work out legally binding instruments to govern cyberspace. But in the absence of this, we should start from the norms and coupled with efforts of confidence building measures, step by step.
Because as Director General Wang Chun said, legally based governance system is the ideal. But because of the decentralized nature of cyber governance system, we have to start from where we can agree on voluntary norms and then build step by step toward having a rule-based governance system. But it'll take time because we are here and the ideal we want to have is here. So how to get there?
Is it a long march to cover the distance? Now, I'd like to point out that 1 year ago, President Xi Jinping, in his address to the International Internet Conference, that we should pay due respect to the idea of cyber sovereignty. Immediately, his words drew fire from the international community, particularly Western countries, as to whether this threatens to endanger free speech. And predecessor to Ban Ki-moon, Mr. Kofi Annan, said in my exclusive interview a few months back that he is very supportive of the idea that human rights know no boundary. Therefore, an integral part of human rights is, of course, the free speech on the internet. What do you think of the concerns of the United Nations? And China, of course, is a party of the UN Charter.
You are absolutely right. The two principles, state sovereignty and the respect for fundamental freedoms, are the two overarching principles of international law UN has recognized in every sphere of human life, including cybersecurity. What does sovereignty means in cyberspace is not just an issue of authority a state can exert on cyberspace, but also it means a responsibility, because whatever happens within the territory of one country, that state has to bear the primary responsibility. Yes, so yes, sovereignty comes with a responsibility, and that's how UN defines concept of sovereignty.
Let me go back to the discrepancies and differences between the United States and China, and of course between China and those countries that call for respect for freedom of speech. Now, do you think this is a big issue? Do you think a violation of free speech should come across as a major threat to cybersecurity, because we have very different political institutions here in China?
The question you raise is very important. As just elaborated by His Excellency Mr. Under-Secretary General, the importance of principle of sovereignty vis-à-vis the important principle of freedom. These should be, in fact, looked at in the right context, because I think the sovereignty issue, I drew much encouragement from what has been transpired throughout the process of the United Nations normative discussions within the context of GGE. They tend to agree, starting from 2013, and now latest last year, they all agree that the principle of sovereignty should be the basis for international law as it pertains to cyberspace. And of course there is a lengthy process for people come to thus far, but nevertheless I just want to share with you one notion, because that though it's true that internet has no boundaries, but nevertheless that internet will have the country of domicile, the IP companies, and also why it's true that internet is virtual, online or offline, but the persons engaged in cyber activities will have to be countries where it's domiciled. So I think they are supposed to be subject to the jurisdiction of the country of their domicile. And Edward Snowden, as you refer to, that in fact that he had been wanted by the United States, and this fact in itself shows that the principle of sovereignty is there, and this virtually tantamount to demonstration of the presence of cyber sovereignty in the process.
Let's come back to examine a landmark document that was first drafted and went into effect back in 1648, the Westphalian Treaty concerning international norms on sovereignty of a nation state. Do you think this landmark treaty is still applicable in the domain of global cybersecurity governance?
Yes, the principle of state sovereignty still holds today, but of course the concept is evolving as times are evolving, meaning back in old days, state sovereignty means absolute power within its territory. But as times are evolving, and also with the UN Charter and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the concept of sovereignty also has been evolving. Now it also means, as I said, responsibility within its territory, but also in cyberspace. Second question which comes with sovereignty is the accountability, because we cannot hold the state responsible for the acts happening outside its territory. but also many states lack the capacity to deal with the threats coming from malicious users of cyberspace to deal with it. So there is also issue of state capacity building. So we have to help those states which may be willing to deal with these threats, but not able to deal with it. They need outside help.
Thank you very much. You're watching Dialogue with His Excellency Mr. Kim Un-soo, Under Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs in the United Nations, and Ambassador Wang Qun, Director General of the Arms Control Department of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who is also China's chief negotiator on Iranian nuclear issues. We've been discussing global cybersecurity governance. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. You've been discussing of course, the gap between developed countries and developing nations with regard to whether there would be enough trust or whether enough technologies could be employed by developing nations to safeguard their own sovereignty or individual rights. So what's your take?
Yes, I think that's much talked about subject, the need for closing the digital gap, because it's widely perceived that there are glaring digital gap between developed countries and developing countries in terms of capacity of cyberspace. So that's why there is a constant call on the part of the international community in the endeavor towards a fair and equitable global internet governance through the build-up of a global cyberspace governance as a whole. And I think they are legitimate, because all in all, I think this calls for efforts on two fronts. On the part of the efforts of international of developing countries on the one hand, and also on the part of developed countries on the other hand. First of all, I think...
First of all, do you think there is a digital gap between developing countries and developing nations?
Sure, it is. I can simply furnish you some data, and I think currently there are only 13 root servers in this world, with 12 in the United States, 10 in the United States, 2 in Europe, and 1 in Japan.
Are you saying that the United States got a key to the cyber nuclear suitcase?
To some
Hope I'm
extent.
not sounding very sensational about this issue.
To some extent, because I think root server are the key. They are all in the hands of developed countries vis-à-vis the absence of any root servers in the developing world. So that's why I think the developing countries, they want to be better represented in the global internet governance, most noticeably I think in ICANN, for instance, and also greater role by government in this structure, in this governance structure. And on the part of developing countries, what is called for are two things. Firstly, I think accountability, and I think that's one thing they need to do more. And secondly is transparency, especially in the process of their decision making. So that's actually two things they are required to do on the part of them.
The NATO recently declared that if one player, be it a state or non-state player, launches a cyber attack on the telecommunication infrastructure or infrastructure of the cyberspace, that will amount to a declaration of war. Is that so serious, Mr. Under Secretary?
That's one of the crucial issues UN has been looking at through a group of governmental experts process, because the international law should apply to cyberspace. And also, we reaffirm the principle that international law should apply to cyberspace, not only in peacetime, but also during the time of war.
But is it easy to identify
Yes.
who is the attacker?
Very difficult.
Whether it is a state attacker or non-state player? Because
So
that will make a difference.
Yes.
Prerequisite for declare wartime vis-a-vis peacetime in itself will have to be based themselves on international law. So this calls for virtually the need to discuss an important question you just referred to. Under the existing international law, whether it is sufficient, whether it could be tailored to take care of the cyberspace thing. In fact, that clearly that there is no such existing international law. People argue that for instance, in the case of the law of armed conflict, whether it may apply to cyberspace. In fact, that this is a subject of heated discussion, bilaterally or multilaterally, and the people are arguing that, for instance, in our case, we tend to say that, wait, we need to study. We do not say categorically yes or no, but nevertheless that we need to study, because no matter how relevant it is, it needs to be examined. I'm referring to the law of armed conflict. It's, for instance, I think may be good, but it came into being about 100 years ago. It could be Shakespearean's gowns or dress. It's beautiful, but when you wear them and walk onto the Oxford Street in London or Fifth Avenue in New York, people might be stunned. So let's take a look whether I think it could be.
He seems to be suggesting that it's a dilemma of to be or not to be, to cite the words of William Shakespeare. By the way, the issue of terrorism also generates headlines today for the world media. The internet is increasingly becoming the forum for terrorists or terrorist organizations to disseminate hate speeches or words of fears, and they tend to generate a panic. Contributing to social instability in many cases. Taking the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, for example, July the 5th tragedy actually came from such a dissemination of false information. What do you think of the concerns of the United Nations in this particular regard?
That's one of biggest concern and rising concern, because as you said, terrorists misusing, abusing internet and cyberspace to incite hatred and also recruit. And they are spreading very bad narratives for that malicious purposes. And the international community must find a way to stay ahead of the curve, otherwise we lose a war through cyberspace. So we have to find a way how to counter that those narratives now spread by terrorists and other extremists using cyberspace, and that's the challenge we are facing.
Ambassador Wang, do you think the current geopolitical competitions between the United States and China, I'm not talking about the South China Sea, will prevent the two major players from having more cooperation in, for example, the areas of intelligence report exchanges to jointly fight terrorism?
I have to confess that we do have differences on the question of cyberspace in terms of strategy, in terms of how we can deal with them through whatever means maybe I think different based on geopolitics consideration, geopolitical consideration as you perceive, or based on whatever. But nevertheless, that the common interest we share is far greater than the differences between Washington and Beijing on this score. For instance, I think in meeting the challenges of commercial theft as a result of cyber activities, and also meeting the challenges of cyber crimes, meeting the challenges of malicious actions of attacking the critical internet infrastructures, and also the need for us to work together to combat the cyber terrorism. All these, I think, we do share. And also, apart from these, we think that the economic consideration is also for the two sides to work together, because I think we, for our part, are working vigorously to shift the economic development model, adjust the development structure through the implementation of the big data, national big data strategy, the Internet Plus, to integrate with the objective of in-depth integration of digital and real economy. U.S., for its part, for sound economic recovery, for greater competitiveness, they have to enter into good cooperation with China as far as cyberspace is concerned. So that's why it is against this backdrop that the two leaders reached the important consensus last September, and subsequently 2 rounds of high-level dialogue has been convened between the two
Very
capitals.
quickly, Mr. Undersecretary, the alleged theft of intellectual property constitutes a major threat to many countries, and China is a victim, of course, of IPR violations. Do you think, as a developing country, we do share this concern? But on the other hand, do you think China is doing enough to prevent such violations of IPR?
Well, of course, the expectation of the international community always higher than what the governments can meet. But clearly, as Ambassador Wang Chun just said, there are still differences in approaches and expectations. But as long as US and China share the common interest, which I believe far outweigh the cost and the differences, then I believe that will form a very strong baseline from which international community can advance its normative framework and operational strategy. Because without China and US joining, any strategy in cyberspace or global counterterrorism strategy cannot succeed. So that's the bottom line, and I really want to encourage Ambassador Wang Chun and Chinese government to move along on that front with
in
the
fact,
US.
that in our bilateral discussions, I try to encourage our U.S. colleagues to look seriously that with regard to international law, existing international law, where it pertains to IP protections, and we could always examine why can't we be more forthcoming. So that's the question I posed them. Instead of confining ourselves just to a category of international laws, so we should be more forthcoming, and especially by identifying and working out the way forward in this regard.
But there, I'd like to emphasize one point. Even we discussed the digital divide, and bridging the digital divide is important. But between the key players, big states particularly,
Yes.
bridging the trust gap.
Yes.
So building confidence between the key players is very important and critical to advancing any multilateral efforts for governance structure to be rooted.
Well, thank you very much. Indeed, we need to consider the idea of building the cyber version of a One Belt, One Road initiative to emphasize interconnectivity. Thank you very much for your participation in this meaningful edition of Dialogue. Until next time, goodbye.